Officer Miller thought he was cleaning up the streets when he slammed a nobody against the courthouse stone. He didn't see the gold seal in her bag. He didn't see the fury in her eyes. And he definitely didn't realize that in 10 minutes, he'd be standing in her courtroom, begging for a mercy she no longer possessed. The humidity in downtown Philadelphia was thick enough to choke the life out of the morning. Officer Miller adjusted his belt, the leather creaking like a warning sign nobody bothered to heed. He stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, a gatekeeper of a system he had long ago learned to bend to his own will. To him, the world was divided into two groups, those with a badge and those who belonged in a cage. He saw her then. Maya Sterling walked with a purpose that Miller found offensive. She wasn't wearing a suit, she was in civilian clothes, a simple, elegant dress that suggested she was just another citizen coming to witness the machinery of the law, not operate it. In her hand, she clutched a leather briefcase. To Miller, that briefcase didn't look like it held legal briefs. It looked like a target. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" Miller's voice cut through the morning air like a jagged blade. Maya didn't stop. She didn't even flinch. She was a woman who had spent 23 years in rooms where her voice was the final word. She simply kept walking toward the heavy bronze doors. Miller moved with a speed born of practiced aggression. He stepped into her path, his chest puffed out, blocking the sunlight. "I'm talking to you. You got ears or just an attitude?" Maya Sterling looked up. She didn't look at his eyes. She looked at his badge number. "I have a 9:00 a.m. start, officer. Move aside." The disrespect hit Miller like a physical blow. In his world, people like her, black women with heads held too high, were supposed to look at the ground when he spoke. He didn't see a federal judge. He saw what he later called a ghetto rat trying to sneak into a place where she didn't belong. "You have a start. In where?" "The holding cell," Miller sneered. Before Maya could respond, before she could even reach for the identification in her pocket, Miller's hand moved. It wasn't a tactical maneuver. It was a statement of dominance. His open palm cracked against Maya's face with a sickening thud. The force was enough to send her head snapping sideways. The expensive briefcase flew from her grip, the latch bursting open. Legal documents, files that held the fates of dozens of people, scattered across the dirty stone steps like white confetti in a windstorm. Maya gasped, the air leaving her lungs as Miller grabbed her by the throat. He didn't care about the cameras. He didn't care about the witnesses. He slammed her back against the cold, unforgiving stone wall of the courthouse. "Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses," he hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath smelling of stale coffee and unearned power. Maya's jaw throbbed. The world was spinning, a blur of gray stone and blue uniforms. But as Miller twisted her arms behind her back, the metal handcuffs biting deep into her wrists, her eyes found something. Just 20 feet away, above the main entrance, was a bronze nameplate. It was polished and gleaming in the morning sun. It read, "The Honorable Judge Maya Sterling presiding." She was being brutalized by the very system she had sworn to protect. Around them, other officers didn't move to stop him. They didn't call for a supervisor. Instead, they gathered in a loose circle, the light catching the screens of their phones as they began to record, laughing as if they were watching a comedy routine instead of a felony assault. "Check the bag, Miller," one of the officers, a man named Rodriguez, shouted, "probably full of stolen identities." Miller kicked the scattered papers aside, his boot treading over a judicial memorandum. He didn't bother to read it. He just saw a woman in handcuffs, a bruise already blooming like a dark flower on her cheek. "Let's get her inside," Miller barked. "I've got a story to write, and by the time I'm done, she's going to be the villain of this little tale." As they dragged her through the side entrance, Maya Sterling remained silent. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She was a student of the law, and she knew that every word Miller spoke, every laugh from the gallery, and every bruise on her skin was a nail being driven into the coffin of his career. Miller straightened his uniform, chest heaving with adrenaline. He felt like a hero. He felt invincible. He had done this dance 100 times before, spin the story, control the narrative, make the victim look like the aggressor. The system always believed the badge. It always believed the man in blue. But as the heavy doors of the courtroom swung shut behind them, the air changed. The temperature seemed to drop. Miller didn't know it yet, but he hadn't just made an arrest. He had just walked into his own execution. The courtroom air was sterile, smelling of old wood and floor wax, but to Officer Miller, it smelled like victory. He straightened his navy blue uniform, his fingers grazing the cold steel of his handcuffs, a reminder of the power he held over the woman sitting at the defendant's table. He had done this dance 100 times before. Spin the story. Control the narrative. Transform the victim into the villain before the first gavel strike even hit. He cleared his throat, stepping onto the witness stand with the rehearsed confidence of a seasoned actor. He didn't look at the woman he had just assaulted. To him, she was just another ghetto rat whose life was about to be dismantled by the system she dared to walk toward. "Your Honor," Miller began, his voice steady, projecting an aura of calm professionalism. "At approximately 08:47 hours, I was conducting routine security protocols at the main entrance. I encountered a suspicious individual attempting to breach the perimeter without identification." He gestured toward Maya Sterling. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded. A dark, purple bruise was now blooming across her left cheek like a mark of shame. To anyone else, it was evidence of a crime. To Miller, it was just the minimum necessary force required to keep the peace. "The defendant was acting erratically," Miller continued, his lies rolling off his tongue like honey. "She refused to comply with standard safety procedures. She was dressed inappropriately for court and was carrying a briefcase filled with what appeared to be stolen or sensitive legal documents." In the gallery, officers Rodriguez and Thompson exchanged knowing smirks. They had heard this script before, different faces, same lies. They knew how this worked. The system always believed the word of a man in uniform over a woman who looked like her. Judge Thorne, a thin man in his late 60s who was filling in for the day, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "And did the defendant become physically combative, Officer Miller?" "Extremely, sir," Miller lied, not even blinking. "She became verbally aggressive, using profanity and making wild threats. She kept screaming that she was someone important, a common tactic used by these people to avoid accountability." He let a small, condescending smile play on his lips. "I've seen this playbook before, Your Honor. She claimed to be a lawyer, perhaps even a judge, anything to circumvent the law." Maya Sterling didn't interrupt. She didn't shout. Her eyes were locked on the stenographer, whose fingers flew across the keys, capturing every syllable of Miller's perjury for the permanent record. She was letting him build his own gallows, one lie at a time. "When I attempted to place her in protective custody for the public's safety, she resisted," Miller added, his voice rising with righteous indignation. "I was forced to use force to subdue her. Her injuries are purely a result of her own combative behavior." The prosecutor, Sandra Walsh, nodded sympathetically. "Officer Miller, in your 15 years of service, have you seen this pattern of behavior before?" "Unfortunately, yes," Miller sighed, playing the part of the weary public servant. "There are certain individuals who believe the rules don't apply to them. They use accusations of discrimination as a shield for their criminal actions. It's an insult to the real victims of this city." As Miller spoke, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I have partial footage of the encounter, though unfortunately, my body cam suffered a technical malfunction right as the violence began." "How convenient," Maya Sterling whispered, her voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the water glass on the prosecutor's table. Miller winked at her, a quick, cruel gesture of total dominance. He thought he had won. He thought he was the hero of the story. He had no idea that the silent woman in the bruised skin was currently calculating the exact number of years he would spend behind bars. He was so busy basking in the support of the courtroom gallery that he failed to notice the young law clerk in the back row. She wasn't nodding. She was frowning, staring at Maya with a look of growing, terrifying recognition. Miller leaned back, feeling the weight of the badge on his chest. "Actions have consequences, Your Honor," he concluded, repeating the words he had hissed at her on the steps. And today, the defendant learned that lesson the hard way. The courtroom fell silent. The trap was set. The bait was taken. And now the predator was about to become the prey. The silence in the courtroom was no longer empty. It was heavy, vibrating with a tension that made the air feel like glass about to shatter. Officer Miller stepped down from the stand, a smug grin tugging at the corner of his mouth as he adjusted his tactical vest. He had delivered a performance worthy of an Oscar, painting a picture of a dangerous, erratic trespasser who forced his hand. "The defendant may now present her statement," Judge Thorne announced, his voice devoid of interest, as if he were simply reading a grocery list before heading to lunch. Maya Sterling rose. She didn't scramble. She didn't look at the floor. Despite the handcuffs clinking softly against one another and the purple bruise marring her skin, she stood with a spine made of tempered steel. The dignity she projected was so immense that the prosecutor, Sandra Walsh, felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to straighten her own jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor," Maya said. Her voice wasn't the scream of a victim. It was the calm, resonant boom of a commander. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these creative allegations." Miller let out a short, mocking huff from the gallery, but Maya didn't even turn her head. She looked directly at Judge Thorne. "First, let's address the charge of trespassing on government property," she began, her tone taking on a rhythmic, legal cadence. "Officer Miller testified that I was in a restricted area. However, I was on the public sidewalk approaching the main entrance at 8:47 a.m. Your Honor, I'm sure you're familiar with the Supreme Court ruling in Hague v. Committee for Industrial Organization, which establishes that public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums where citizens have a constitutional right to be present." The stenographer's fingers, which had been moving lazily, suddenly began to blur across the keys. Judge Thorne blinked, his eyes widening. This wasn't the rambling, emotional defense of a ghetto rat. This was a surgical strike. "Furthermore," Maya continued, her voice growing colder, "Officer Miller suggested I was involved in a fraud scheme because I carried documents with judicial letterhead. Those documents are indeed authentic legal materials, specifically pending case files and judicial memoranda, all of which I have legitimate access to in my professional capacity." "Professional capacity?" Judge Thorne interrupted, leaning so far forward he was nearly falling off the bench. "And what exactly is your profession, MS?" "Sterling," Maya corrected firmly. "And I think we'll get to my background in a moment, Your Honor. But first, I'd like to discuss the malfunction of Officer Miller's body camera." Miller felt a drop of cold sweat slide down his spine. He shifted in his seat, his leather belt creaking in the silence. "Officer Miller testified that his camera failed," Maya said, turning her head slowly to lock eyes with him. "But under Federal Rule of Evidence 106, I have reason to believe that comprehensive video and audio evidence of this morning's incident exists and will be made available to this court. This courthouse has high-definition security cameras every 15 feet. Additionally, the county maintains automatic backup systems for all officer body cam footage, a system that uploads data every 60 seconds, regardless of whether the officer claims a malfunction." The color drained from Miller's face so fast it looked like he'd seen a ghost. He had forgotten about the cloud backups. He had forgotten that in the digital age, lies have nowhere to hide. "I formally request," Maya's voice now rang out like a bell, "that this court issue a preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from this morning, including body cam backup files and any mobile phone recordings made by the officers currently laughing in the gallery." "Objection," Sandra Walsh stood up, her voice sounding desperate. "The defendant cannot make evidentiary demands without representation." Maya turned to her, a small, terrifying smile playing on her lips. "Under the Sixth Amendment, a pro se defendant has the constitutional right to present evidence in their own defense. Furthermore, Brady v. Maryland establishes the prosecution's obligation to preserve potentially exculpatory evidence. Are you suggesting, Counselor, that the law doesn't apply today?" The silence that followed was deafening. "Ms. Sterling," Judge Thorne whispered, his voice trembling. "You seem unusually familiar with legal procedure. Do you have formal training?" Maya walked as far as the handcuffs would allow, her eyes gleaming with a dark, satisfied amusement. "I have some experience, Your Honor. In fact, I was scheduled to be in this building at 9:00 a.m. sharp to preside over a hearing." In the back of the room, the bailiff, a man named Henderson, stood up as if he'd been struck by lightning. He stared at Maya's face, then at the bruise, then back at her eyes. His jaw hit his chest. "Your Honor," Maya said softly, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a leather credential wallet. She flipped it open. The gold judicial seal caught the overhead light, blinding Miller from across the room. "I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding about who exactly Officer Miller assaulted on the steps of this courthouse." Miller's knees buckled. He grabbed the table to keep from falling as the world he thought he controlled began to burn to the ground. The courtroom didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. The air was sucked out of the room as Judge Thorne stared at the gold seal in Maya's hand. He looked at the credentials, then at the bruised woman in handcuffs, and then, with a look of pure, unadulterated terror, at Officer Miller. "Counselors, Officer Miller," Thorne's voice was a ghost of its former self. "We will take a 15-minute recess, immediately." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't strike the gavel. He practically bolted toward his chambers. The bailiff, Henderson, moved before the order was even finished. He didn't look at Miller. He didn't look at the prosecutor. He walked straight to Maya Sterling, his hands trembling as he reached for his key ring. Clink, clink. The handcuffs fell to the floor, the heavy metal hitting the carpet with a sound that signaled the end of Miller's life as he knew it. "I am so sorry, Your Honor," Henderson whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't know it was you." Maya rubbed her wrists, the red welt standing out against her skin like war paint. She didn't look at Henderson. She looked through the gallery, her gaze landing on Miller like a predator locking onto its prey. Miller was frozen. His face, once flushed with the heat of his own ego, was now the color of wet ash. He looked at his partner, Rodriguez, for support, but Rodriguez was already moving toward the exit, trying to vanish before the storm broke. The blue wall of silence was crumbling in real time. "Officer Miller," Maya said, her voice a low, lethal purr. "Don't leave. We have a lot to discuss regarding your security protocols." The 15 minutes felt like 15 years. In the hallway, news of the assault was spreading through the courthouse like a wildfire in a dry forest. Clerks, lawyers, and janitors whispered in the shadows. The woman Miller had slapped wasn't just a judge. She was Maya Sterling, the woman who had spent the last decade dismantling systemic corruption. She was the one person Miller should have feared most. Inside the private robbing room, Maya stood before a mirror. She looked at the bruise on her cheek. She didn't try to cover it with makeup. She didn't try to hide the pain. She wanted the world to see what a hero in blue looked like when he thought nobody was watching. She reached for the black silk robe, hanging on the wall. As she pulled it over her shoulders, the transformation was complete. The victim was gone. The suspect was dead. In her place stood the physical embodiment of the third branch of government. She zipped the robe up to her throat, the black fabric hiding the dress Miller had mocked. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted from a trial to a funeral. Miller was sitting at the back, his head in his hands. He was no longer the hunter. He was the one waiting for the blade to fall. The side door opened. "All rise," Henderson shouted, but his voice lacked its usual bark. It sounded like a plea. Instead of Judge Thorne, it was Maya Sterling who stepped onto the dais. She didn't look down. She looked ahead, her silhouette framed by the Great Seal of the United States. She climbed the steps to the bench, the same bench Miller had claimed she didn't belong near. She sat in the high-backed leather chair. The height of the bench made her look 10 feet tall. She looked down at the empty witness stand where Miller had just finished lying under oath. Thud. She struck the gavel. The sound echoed through the high ceilings, sharp and final. "This court is now back in session," Maya announced. Her voice was different now. It had the weight of the law behind it. It was the voice of a woman who was about to turn Miller's story into his formal indictment. "Mr. Miller," she said, not calling him officer, "please return to the stand. You were just telling us about the combative behavior you encountered this morning. I'd like to hear more, for the record." Miller looked up, his eyes wide and glassy. He looked at the bench. He looked at the robe. He looked at the bruise he had put on her face. And for the first time in his life, Officer Miller knew exactly what it felt like to be powerless. The courtroom was no longer a place of bureaucracy. It had become a chamber of judgment. Maya Sterling sat behind the high mahogany bench, her silhouette framed by the Great Seal of the United States. Below her, the man who had bruised her face and insulted her soul sat in the witness chair. Officer Miller looked small. For the first time in 15 years, the badge on his chest felt like a weight rather than a shield. "Mr. Miller," Maya began, her voice echoing through the silent gallery. She didn't use his rank. She had stripped him of that the moment she put on the robe. "You mentioned earlier under oath that you encountered a suspicious individual who was acting erratically. Do you stand by that statement?" Miller swallowed hard. The sound was audible in the back row. "I made an assessment based on the situation at the time, ma'am." "Ma'am," Maya's eyebrow arched, a sharp, cold movement. "In this room, I am Your Honor. And in this room, lies have a very short lifespan. Let's talk about your assessment. You stated the defendant, myself, used profanity and made wild threats. Tell the court, Mr. Miller. Exactly what did I say that you found so threatening?" Miller opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was a man who lived by the script of he said, she said. But today, the she was the one holding the gavel. "I don't recall the exact words," Miller stammered. "Allow me to refresh your memory," Maya said, her voice dropping an octave, turning into a low, dangerous rumble. "I told you I had a 9:00 a.m. start. I told you to move aside. Was that the threat? Or was the threat the fact that I didn't look like someone who would bow to you?" "Objection." The prosecutor, Sandra Walsh, stood up, but her voice was weak. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. A presiding judge cannot also be the lead witness and the victim." Maya didn't even look at her. "Overruled. This is not a standard trial anymore, counselor. This is an inquiry into the integrity of this court's security. Sit down." The prosecutor sank back into her chair, as if she had been physically shoved. "Now, Mr. Miller," Maya continued, leaning forward. The bruise on her cheek was a dark purple now, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "You mentioned a technical malfunction with your body camera. It's a curious thing, isn't it? Technology always seems to fail right when a police officer decides to use his fists." "It happens, Your Honor," Miller whispered, his eyes darting toward the exit. "It does," Maya agreed. "But as I mentioned before, the cloud doesn't have malfunctions. While we were in recess, I took the liberty of having the clerk of courts pull the automatic backup from the server. Would you like to see it? Or should we just play it for the gallery so your friends, Rodriguez and Thompson, can see themselves on the big screen?" Miller's breath hitched. He looked toward his fellow officers in the back row. Rodriguez was staring at his boots. Thompson was pale. The blue wall wasn't just cracking, it was being demolished by a wrecking ball in black silk. "Play the footage," Maya commanded. The large monitors on the courtroom walls flickered to life. The image was crisp, high definition. It showed the courthouse steps from 3 different angles. It showed Maya walking peacefully. It showed Miller stepping into her path with a sneer. And then it showed the slap. The sound on the recording was a sickening crack that made half the people in the gallery flinch. The video showed Miller slamming Maya against the wall. It captured his voice, clear, cold, and hateful. "Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses." The courtroom erupted in a collective gasp. In the back, a reporter from the city's largest newspaper began typing furiously. Maya hit the pause button. Miller's face was frozen on the screen, his hand wrapped around Maya's throat. "That animal you were referring to, Mr. Miller," Maya said, her voice as cold as a mountain stream, "has a doctorate in jurisprudence from Harvard. That animal has served this city for 2 decades. That animal is the one who decides whether you walk out of this building today or leave it in chains." She leaned back, the leather of her chair creaking like a hangman's rope. "You didn't just assault a woman today, Mr. Miller. You assaulted the very idea of justice. You looked at a citizen and saw a target because of the color of her skin and the pride in her walk. You thought the badge gave you the right to be a god, but today, you're just a defendant." Miller looked down at his hands. They were shaking. "Mr. Miller," Maya said, her voice now a whisper that filled every corner of the room. "Do you have anything to say before I turn this evidence over to the Internal Affairs Division and the district attorney for a felony assault and perjury indictment?" Miller looked up, a single tear of self-pity rolling down his cheek. "I didn't know it was you." Maya's eyes flashed with a fire that seemed to burn through the bench. "That is the most honest thing you've said all day. You didn't know it was me. You thought I was someone who couldn't fight back. You thought I was someone who didn't matter." She picked up the gavel. "But in this city, Mr. Miller, everyone matters." The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker. The air was thick with the scent of fear, a scent that Officer Miller knew well, though he was usually the one inflicting it. Now it was coming from him. But Maya Sterling wasn't finished with just one man. She knew that a bully rarely acts alone. They require an audience. They require a wall. "Officer Rodriguez, Officer Thompson, step forward," Maya commanded. Her voice didn't rise in volume, but it carried the weight of a falling mountain. The two officers in the gallery froze. Rodriguez, who had been laughing on the video just moments ago, looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floorboards. Thompson, the one who had recorded the assault on his phone, moved toward the front with the mechanical stiffness of a man walking toward a firing squad. "Take the stand, Mr. Rodriguez," Maya said, her eyes never leaving his face. As Rodriguez sat in the same chair Miller had just vacated, he refused to look at the bench. He looked at his lap. He looked at the water pitcher. He looked everywhere except at the bruised face of the woman he had mocked. "Mr. Rodriguez," Maya began, leaning over the bench so far that her shadow fell across him. "On the video we just witnessed, I see you standing 5 feet away while your partner slammed a citizen against a stone wall. I see you laughing. I see you making a joke about stolen identities while my judicial files were being stepped on." "I was just following his lead, Your Honor," Rodriguez stammered. "Miller was the senior officer. I thought he had a reason. I thought there was a threat." "A threat," Maya repeated the word as if it were poison in her mouth. "You are trained to de-escalate. You are trained to intervene when a fellow officer uses excessive force. Yet in that video, I don't see an officer of the law. I see a spectator at a blood sport." She turned her gaze to Thompson, who was standing by the jury box, trembling. "And you, Mr. Thompson, you were recording. Tell me, where is that footage? Is it in the evidence locker? Did you file it with your report?" Thompson's voice was a high-pitched squeak. "No, Your Honor, I deleted it." The courtroom let out a collective, sharp intake of breath. "You deleted it," Maya said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft whisper. "You destroyed evidence of a felony assault committed by a public servant. You stood by and watched a woman be brutalized, and your first instinct wasn't to help. It was to capture it for your own amusement, and then hide it to protect a criminal." "We have a brotherhood, Your Honor," Rodriguez blurted out, a desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. "We look out for each other." "A brotherhood." Maya's gavel hit the desk with a sound like a gunshot. Crack. "The only brotherhood that exists in this room is the one defined by the Constitution of the United States. Your badge is not a membership card to a gang. It is a contract with the people. And today, you have breached that contract in the most disgusting way possible." She stood up, her black robes billowing like the wings of an avenging shadow. "Mr. Rodriguez, Mr. Thompson, you had a choice on those steps. You could have been the men you swore to be. You could have put a hand on Miller's shoulder and told him to stop. You could have picked up those scattered papers. You could have treated me like a human being." She leaned over the bench, her eyes burning into theirs. "But you chose the wall. You chose the silence. And now that wall is going to fall on top of you." Maya turned to the court clerk. "Record this. I am formally recommending to the police commissioner and the Internal Affairs Division that Officers Rodriguez and Thompson be suspended without pay, effective immediately, pending a full investigation into conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The two officers looked like they had been turned to stone. They weren't just losing their jobs, they were losing their pensions, their reputations, and their freedom. "Bailiff," Maya said, looking at Henderson, "escort these men out of my courtroom. They are no longer authorized to carry weapons in this building. They are no longer authorized to represent the law." As Henderson stepped forward to take their badges, the silence in the room was absolute. The blue wall hadn't just cracked, it had turned to dust. Miller, still sitting in the back, watched as his friends were stripped of their authority. He realized then that he wasn't just going to jail. He was going to be the man who took everyone down with him. Maya sat back down, her face a mask of cold, hard justice. "We're not done," she whispered. "Now we talk about the sentencing." The news didn't just leak, it erupted. Outside the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, the hallway was a sea of flashbulbs and shouting reporters. The video of the courthouse assault had been leaked to the press by a whistleblower in the IT department, and within the hour, it was the lead story from New York to Los Angeles. The city was waking up to a monster in its midst, and that monster wore a badge. Inside, the atmosphere was different. It was the quiet of a graveyard. Maya Sterling sat perfectly still. She looked at the gallery, which was now filled with the city's top officials, the police commissioner, the district attorney, and the mayor himself. They hadn't come to support Miller. They had come to distance themselves from the fire he had started. "Officer Miller," Maya said, her voice cutting through the tension like a piano wire. "Stand up." Miller rose, but his legs seemed made of water. He was no longer the imposing figure who had dominated the courthouse steps. He looked like a man who had already been erased. "In my 20 years on the bench," Maya began, "I have seen many things. I have seen desperate men do terrible things for survival. I have seen the broken and the lost. But I have rarely seen the kind of pure, unadulterated malice that you displayed this morning." She picked up the scattered files that the bailiff had recovered from the steps. They were still stained with the dust of the street and a single drop of her own blood. "You looked at me and saw someone you could break," she continued. "You saw a woman you thought had no voice, no power, and no protector. You didn't just strike my face, Miller. You struck the face of every citizen who walks up those steps expecting the law to be their shield. You turned this courthouse into a crime scene." The police commissioner, sitting in the front row, bowed his head. He knew the department was about to face a federal civil rights investigation that would last for years. "Mr. Miller," Maya said, leaning forward, her eyes locking onto his with a terrifying clarity. "You testified that certain individuals believe the rules don't apply to them. You were right, but those individuals aren't the ones in the streets. They are the ones who think their uniform is a license to be a predator." She turned to the district attorney. "Mr. Vance, I am handing over the digital evidence and my own sworn testimony. I expect a grand jury to be impaneled by sunset. Charges of felony assault, official misconduct, and multiple counts of perjury." "We are already on it, Your Honor," Vance replied, his voice firm. He knew that to hesitate now would be political suicide. Maya turned back to Miller. The smugness that had defined him that morning was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunting realization. He wasn't just losing his job, he was going to be the cop in prison, the most dangerous position a man can hold. "You told me on those steps that people like me belong in cages," Maya whispered, the sound carrying to the very back of the room. "The irony is, Miller, the law is a mirror. It shows you exactly who you are. And today, when you look in that mirror, you'll see the man who built his own cage." She reached for her gavel, one last time for the session. "This court is adjourned. Take him into custody." As the bailiff stepped forward, Miller didn't resist. He didn't say a word. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the only noise in the room. This time, they weren't on Maya's wrists. They were on the wrists of the man who thought he was above the law. As Miller was led through the side door, the gallery remained silent. They watched the fall of a tyrant. Maya Sterling sat on her bench, her hand touching the bruise on her cheek. She didn't feel like a victim. She felt like the law. The iron gates of the county jail didn't make a loud noise when they closed behind Miller, just a cold, metallic thud that echoed like the finality of a heartbeat. It was a sound he had forced upon thousands of others, but as it rang in his own ears, it felt like the world was finally righting itself. In the weeks that followed, the city of Philadelphia didn't just move on, it transformed. The video of Judge Maya Sterling delivering her verdict from the bench, bruised, battered, but unbroken, became the most watched courtroom footage in the history of the internet. It was viewed over 50 million times in the first 48 hours. From the skyscrapers of New York to the small towns of the Midwest, people watched in stunned silence as a predator in a uniform was dismantled by the very justice he tried to bury. Officer Miller, once a man who walked with the arrogance of a king, now sat in a 6-by-9-foot cell. He was no longer officer. He was inmate 93,421. He spent his days in protective custody because even in the underworld, there is no respect for a man who strikes a woman and lies about his badge. He had thought he knew his place in the world, and he thought he knew hers. He was tragically, fundamentally wrong about both. Officers Rodriguez and Thompson didn't escape the fallout either. They were terminated from the force without pensions and faced federal charges for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Their recorded laughter, once a sound of shared cruelty on the courthouse steps, was played over and over in a federal classroom as a what not to do for every new recruit in the country. They became the face of a broken system, a reminder that the blue wall is nothing more than a house of cards when the wind of truth begins to blow. Judge Maya Sterling returned to her bench 10 days later. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a faint yellow mark, but the fire in her eyes had only grown brighter. She didn't seek fame. She didn't do interviews. She simply went back to work. Because for Maya, this wasn't about a personal vendetta. It was about the sanctity of the robe. One morning, as she walked up those same stone steps where Miller had once stood, a young girl was waiting for her. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She looked at Maya, then at the courthouse, and then at the gold seal on Maya's bag. "Are you the lady who fought back?" the girl asked in a small, hopeful voice. Maya knelt down, her silk robe brushing the very stone where she had been slammed. She looked the girl in the eye and smiled, a smile that held the weight of 20 years of struggle. "No, honey," Maya whispered. "I'm the lady who reminded them that the law belongs to you." The story of Miller and Maya is more than just a tale of instant karma. It is a testament to the fact that power is a temporary loan, and it can be revoked the moment it is abused. It reminds us that while bullies may own the moment, justice owns the eternity. Miller thought he was cleaning up the streets. Instead, he became the very filth the system had to wash away. He thought he was a hunter. He died a ghost in a concrete room. Because sometimes, justice doesn't just wear a blindfold. Sometimes justice wears judicial robes. Sometimes justice carries a gavel. And sometimes, when the moment is right, justice hits back. Never underestimate the power of standing up to a bully, no matter how much armor they wear. If you believe that every person deserves respect and that the truth always finds a way to the light, then you are part of this story. Hit that like button to show the world that we stand with the Mayas of the world. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because we bring you the stories of courage that the system tries to hide. And share this video. Let it be a warning to those who abuse their power and a beacon to those who feel powerless. Your voice is the gavel. Your attention is the verdict. Until next time, stay vigilant. The truth is always watching.